Okay, cool. Firstly, I see everybody's quiet. My first note was going to be hi, and then can we all please put ourselves on mute, just to minimize any feedback while the presenters are in session. It's so good to see all of you again. We've got, I think, half of you are with us every week, and then it's nice to have some new faces as well. Hi to everyone, and especially to those who are new to the call. My name is Nicole, and I am the community manager at Linum Labs. Linum Labs is a software development studio, and we focused on building solutions in healthcare and identity, as well as communities. And so tonight, I'm excited because my colleagues will be showcasing what we work on every day, especially for those of you who have been on the calls with us for the past 5 or 6 weeks and ask what is it exactly that Jyoti is doing and what exactly do we do at Molecule. So it's going to be really insightful. Yeah, before we start, just again, if you've just joined, please mute your mics. Then just to...
Oh yeah, no, I like that approach.
Hey, Timeless. I'm not too sure how to pronounce that. If we can all put ourselves on mute, just to minimize the feedback. And then, yeah, it would be cool to see.
Apologies, guys. I'm just dialing into my phone. Thank you.
That's all good. If we could, if you're comfortable to share your video, you're welcome to do so. And then lastly, feel free to ask your questions for Tyler and Wayne while they are presenting. I will be facilitating the Q&A session after, and that will give you an opportunity to shoot out any questions you have for Tyler and Wayne. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Tyler from Molecule, who is the scientific lead. It's so exciting to have you with us. And Tyler will be doing, just giving us an introduction to the innovation crisis in pharma and how Molecule aims to solve it. Tyler, the floor is yours.
Hey guys, can everyone hear me clearly? Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And is my screen visible to everyone?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So just a little bit of background about myself before I jump into the actual presentation. So my name's Tyler Golato. I joined Molecule about 8 months ago. My background is in biochemistry and molecular biology. I'm trained as a biochemist. After graduating, I went on to work in experimental therapeutics at Columbia University, initially developing novel therapeutics for pancreatic cancer and glioblastoma, which is a form of brain cancer, and later joined the National Institutes of Health, where I worked on biogerontology, which is the science of aging, more sort of in a basic research context, but with some clinical component. I moved to South Africa about 3 years ago, where I worked briefly in HIV vaccine development, was involved in the predictive analytics space, had a startup company, and then eventually found my way to Molecule, which has been this really cool sort of project initiative for me, because it's sort of focusing on a very high level sort of macroeconomic problem in drug development in general, where a lot of my previous experience had been much sort of on the micro level, thinking about specific drug interactions or how a molecule can drive a certain pathway. So this has been a bit of a departure, but really exciting nonetheless. Just to give you some sense of the direction of this talk, I'm going to try to cover Molecule at a fairly high level, while sort of touching on what my feelings are about the innovation crisis in the pharmaceutical industry. I know this is a blockchain-focused meetup call, but I hope you guys will indulge me while I sort of speak more broadly about the pharmaceutical industry and how some of these innovations that are occurring in sort of the decentralized finance space and open innovation might be exactly what we need to make some big changes in pharma. Okay, so Molecule is essentially a protocol that enables the distributed research, development, and funding of chemical intellectual property. So therapeutics, drugs, drug delivery vehicles. It's a distributed Web 3.0 marketplace for price discovery, funding, and curation of therapeutics at various stages of development, ranging from your earliest stage IP, so let's say very initial, like drugs that were just discovered, have not really been optimized or are not suitable for humans, but might show promise in the future, or even late stage therapeutics that are already in clinical testing. And the core design goals of the protocol is really to distribute the cost, risk, and ownership of drug development to unlock open source innovation mechanisms and ultimately bring more diverse treatments to patients, which I'll touch on again in a moment. Drug development, for those of you that don't know, is something that has gotten extremely expensive, particularly over the past 20 years. 20 to 40 years, I guess. In the 1970s in the United States, you were able to bring a drug to market for about $50 million. Today, that figure has grown to about $2.5 billion on average just to bring a single therapeutic to market. It's a slow and indolent sort of process, 10 to 12 years typically from the point of discovery to the point of a drug reaching market. And beyond that, it is incredibly risky. Think of roughly 1 in 4,000 molecules that are screened actually make it through to the clinical trial stages. But pharma is a huge industry. It's a $1.4 trillion industry. But interestingly, return on research and development investments are projected to hit 0% by 2020. So if you look at this figure here, you can see sort of the internal rate of return has been declining steadily since the 1990s with regards to actual return on investment from every dollar that's invested into R&D. What you can imagine, I mean, I think a lot of people have a lot of thoughts about the pharmaceutical industry and big pharma, but the one thing we do sort of rely on is that they innovate and they bring drugs to patients. And interestingly, that's now fast becoming, not really a viable process for them. And what you're seeing happen, particularly in the United States, more so than other places, because the US sort of indirectly, I think because of loose and lax regulation, really subsidizes healthcare for the rest of the world. We won't get too much into that, but what you're seeing is pharmaceutical companies are now beginning to act in a way that is more in line with, they're not so much focusing on R&D, they're focusing on mergers and acquisitions, they're focusing on hiking the prices of pre-existing drugs to try and turn profits for their shareholders, and identifying, let's say, small startup biotechs that might have a promising drug in the pipeline, purchasing them and then actually carrying through to bring that drug to market. So what you're getting on the whole is just a really sort of strong decline in innovation and R&D. So as I mentioned, innovation and trust is declining. It's at its lowest in decades. There's relatively few new blockbuster drugs that are entering the market. And the current and future outlook in pharma is not particularly strong. At the same time, patient and consumer trust, particularly in places like the United States, is at an all-time low. This is due to very high drug prices and price hikes, as well as certain things that have been exacerbating this problem, like the US opioid crisis, sort of the influence of pharmaceutical companies that are actually having on these public health epidemics. There's many diseases that could be treatable at low cost, yet very few affordable treatments exist. And this is placing an enormous strain on the US healthcare system, for example. I think as of 2019, healthcare expenditures are about 20% of the US GDP. For a country's health, that number shouldn't really exceed 5 or 6%. So obviously this is completely unsustainable and really one of the most significant global challenges that we face. I would say it's up there with climate change in terms of the negative impact that it could eventually have on interconnected global societies. There's a lot of thoughts about the innovation crisis and what is actually perpetuating it. Some scientists believe that all of the low-hanging fruit has been picked, but there's a lot of people who argue that it really just comes down to business models. That we need innovative business models in the pharma space. And the sort of pre-existing model that we've been working on for, let's say, the past 100 years is sort of drying up. There's not a ton of promise there. So while innovation, we sort of believe that one of the primary drivers of this process is really a sort of this declining innovation, is that drug development is sort of fundamentally where software development was 30 years ago. Capital requirements are high, assets are liquid, pricing is difficult. Beyond that, research and development is entirely closed source. So there's, particularly in the pharmaceutical space as opposed to academia, there's not a lot of transparency, data is siloed. There's a lack of collaboration additionally due to patent monopolies, because you have this sort of very high capital allocation requirement up front. It becomes very difficult for, let's say, a university or a small pharmaceutical company to compete in the space. And there's sort of an aggressive hoarding of data and hoarding of information and protection so that companies can have these sort of patent monopolies and allow them to control a market when they eventually bring a drug through. And beyond that, negative data isn't really published, which is sort of resulting additionally in this reproducibility crisis. We believe that the solution is open source research and development and decentralized finance. So what we're trying to do is to take this model that has existed in software development for some time, this idea, for example, that a researcher might commit their data to a GitHub, for example, and essentially foster collaboration. But additionally, we're trying to enable additional economic incentives using blockchain technology, which I'll get into in just a moment. So Molecule essentially is really a radical new way of funding research and development. And what we're trying to do is to leverage blockchain and decentralized finance to sort of change the funding and ownership dynamics in drug and IP development. And this is a sort of a gross oversimplification of what we're doing, but imagine that you were able to crowdsource drug development. And the way, just from a use case sort of perspective, the way I would explain this is, let's say that you have a university that has identified a promising compound or a promising piece of chemical intellectual property. It could be a drug delivery system, for example, but in this case, let's just say that it's a novel malaria medication. Universities typically have been priced out of the drug development ecosystem. 30 years ago, like streptomycin, for example, was discovered in a laboratory at Rutgers, and it cost about $30,000 to bring that drug to market. But today, because of the super high capital allocation requirements that are required up front, universities can't really compete in the drug development landscapes. With Molecule, that university, if they've patented, let's say, a novel discovery, could create an open market for that compound. And other universities, other pharmaceutical companies, retail investors, anyone who had an interest in furthering the development of that drug would be able to actually invest directly and own a piece of that intellectual property. The main innovation that Molecule is trying to achieve is the distribution of fractionalized intellectual property to essentially open source and distribute ownership, risk, cost in drug development. So through these markets that we're creating, let's say you have this market for a novel malaria drug, a retail investor, patient advocacy group, other universities could invest and share the burden, the risk, and the rewards of drug development. We essentially have a case where IP creators will be able to create public markets for novel or existing intellectual property, and from that access liquidity, they would be able to crowdfund the development. They could use these models to sort of bootstrap price discovery and also incentivize open collaboration. And the whole sort of goal of this ecosystem is to align all of the various stakeholders in drug development in one place where collaboration can occur. So just to paint another picture, large pharmaceutical companies might use this platform to offload and sell shares in IP that is dormant, that they do not have a plan to develop. It essentially allows that dormant IP to become productive if there's another party that does wish to develop it. Smaller universities have the ability to get access to funding that they wouldn't have access to previously. Essentially, we also create data commons around some of these things, so collaboration can take place in real time. Yeah, so that's sort of the idea, creating a holistic ecosystem where all the various stakeholders in drug discovery can collaborate to develop therapeutics. And this just sort of breaks it down, I guess, in a way that makes a bit more sense. So let's say an individual has a patent, they can sell shares in this patent, and patients, universities, investors, the pharmaceutical industry en masse would be able to buy shares in those compounds. And what we're using to actually, so sort of the blockchain element that comes into this is, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with the technology, is token bonding curves. So basically, we're able to create these markets that people can buy into and sell out of relatively quickly, relatively easily, with very little friction along a predetermined pricing algorithm that corresponds directly to the number of shares that are being issued. That's particularly powerful because it allows us to create sort of predefined functions for different sorts of funding scenarios. And so by allowing any market participant to acquire a stake in the future success of a drug or a therapeutic, we're also creating additional incentives for research to be conducted and released in public. This means that anyone from an institutional investor to a trader to patients, researchers can directly get involved in drug development by funding the development of this intellectual property. And there's also, because of that, a strong curation component to this. This sort of crowd intelligence will hopefully help coordinate activities around sort of identifying the most valuable treatments and directing capital towards them. And interestingly, stakeholders can also take short positions if they believe an asset is overvalued. So we're trying to essentially create a system where, if let's say you're an academic or you're a scientist and you believe that let's say the data that's coming out about a particular compound listed on this marketplace is false, you can actually short that. And further, we try to create a public commons of data so that scientists, patients, organizations that wish to profit from their positions do so by releasing the results of the research into the public, both positive or negative. And one of the other things that we're trying to work on from a legal perspective is creating novel research use exemptions to patent protection whenever IP is listed on the Molecule platform. And this allows stakeholders in the ecosystem to legally research and publish data about previously closed IP. So beyond actually just distributing cost, risk, ownership of drug development, we also we're placing a lot of emphasis on open science and trying to encourage collaboration. I briefly mentioned the token bonding curve side of this. I think you guys have probably had some talks about this technology previously, and I'm sure most people sort of understand what it's doing. Really, this is a particularly important part of our system because traditionally, if I was trying to sell IP or sell securitized IP or sell shares in, let's say, a compound, you would need an underwriter. In this case, we have a smart contract actually handling those transactions. So if I want to buy into these markets, I simply could give the smart contract capital and it will issue me tokens, which represent shares in that compound. Similarly, I could sell those shares back to the smart contract and receive, let's say, capital in exchange. So it allows a relatively low friction method to actually fund drug development, for example, or lock up capital in a curve. And it also provides sort of a permanent liquidity pool to investors. We're looking at a lot of interesting ways to superimpose various scenarios, various, I guess, curve designs. So for example, a sigmoidal curve versus a linear curve against different sort of funding scenarios in drug development. For example, a sigmoidal curve where you have this sort of steep inflection point where essentially the price would be raising rapidly against small increases in supply could be used to bootstrap certain forms, or let's say later stages of investment where big capital allocation or a lot of capital was required at that point in the project. Yeah, this is sort of where we're at currently. We've gone through prototype development in our seed and our initial seed round. We're beginning to actually launch sort of an alpha and beta round in the coming years. It's going to take quite a while to develop this. It's a hyper ambitious project, which is why we really need to get people from the community involved. Yeah, this is our team and some of our advisors. But what I wanted to take the last part of this talk to do is to actually briefly show you, if it's okay, sort of a dashboard example of one of our prototypes, which I feel helps make what I'm talking about a little bit more concrete. So I'm going to do another screen share with you in a moment. Just bear with me.
Thanks, Tyler. I see, in the meanwhile, I see that the comment section is unusually quiet. Yeah, we will feel free to pop in those questions, guys.
So just to give you, can everyone see this?
That's perfect, thank you.
Cool, so let's say that you had a particular compound that was listed on here. What you have here is a token supply curve. So this sort of shows you the price per share and the supply of those, the supply of tokens that are available. So the sort of shares that have been issued at any given time. We also have a price and volume chart. So you could see sort of the financial history of that compound. And then below that, we have these sort of funding milestones. So the idea is that you can actually, if there's preclinical development work that needs to be carried out, for example, you can create specific funding goals for for various stages of preclinical development. For example, target validation, preclinical testing, phase 1 clinical trials. This is obviously just hypothetical data. These numbers are much smaller than they would typically be. But essentially, there's also a component to this, which is sort of allowing preclinical work around a drug to be developed, and those efforts to be coordinated on the platform itself. And additionally, you can see here project tasks. If you're another research laboratory, let's say, people who create these markets and actually have an interest in seeing their drug developed and brought to market can actually create bounties for some of that work. So if one of those bounties, for example, was, synthesis and isolation or combinatorial chemistry, another university, another pharmaceutical company could apply for that bounty. And now, instead of actually purchasing shares by exchanging capital, they would be able to simply perform, let's say, a series of experiments that would be dictated by the initial IP creator. And in exchange for completing those experiments and furthering the drug's development, they would receive some stake in the intellectual property, so fractionalized ownership. Yeah, I just sort of wanted to give some idea into what the platform actually might look like, because I think it helps make it a bit more concrete for people. For example, if you were browsing, you'd be able to look at specific projects, what stage they're at, the type of financial performance that they've been experiencing, their funding goals. Yeah, so it's this really, really interesting sort of project that could completely reimagine the way that we think about drug development. It's a sort of an entirely new business model. Yeah, and we're really excited about the future. It's going to take a lot of work to get there. Yeah, but we can't wait to see how it goes. And thanks so much for listening to me speak.
Thank you so much, Tyler. Yeah, thank you for that great overview of Molecule. And yeah, the second part of that as well. I think it's always great for people to see what we're talking about. I see that there are questions submitted for you, but again, I'll read them out during the Q&A session. Yeah, so thanks again. Any comments or questions for Tyler? Yeah, we'll touch on that after Wayne's presentation. So we have our second speaker, who is Wayne, and Wayne is the community manager at Protea. This evening he'll be giving us an overview on his work focusing on decentralizing communities at Protea. Wayne.
Good evening.
Hi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Yeah, good evening, guys. My name is Wayne, community manager of Protea. And yeah, I'm really excited to walk you guys through exactly what Protea is all about and what the Protea team has been up to over the last few months. Yeah, let me share my screen. 1 second. Can you guys see my screen?
That's perfect, Wayne.
Cool. Okay, let's get this started. So the reason why we have kind of come up with the name Protea, and I thought it would be nice to give you guys a nice little feedback as to why we chose it. As you guys know, if you don't know, Protea is a unique flower to South Africa, as well, predominantly the Western Cape. And the flower itself is quite a resilient and adaptable flower, and that's exactly how we have analyzed communities. With Protea, we essentially want to lay that foundation, because community to us means collaborating in ways that benefit each of us and the community as a whole. So what we first have is our main product, which is Protea X. It's an open source and decentralized software protocol that provides a backbone to the emerging cooperative ecosystems. To put that simply, I want you guys to envision Protea X as like a toolbox or a set of tools. And with that, we've crafted something called Protea Gather, which is essentially our first use case. And with Protea Gather, we want to kind of bring people together and encourage that sustainable engagement that every community would thrive on. And in that ecosystem, reward the commitments that any community is looking to get to evolve. So with Gather, it is the first decentralized app that is built on the protocol. And we essentially want those community interactions to be tokenized. And the goal here is to actually foster healthy communities and visualize that social capital to incentivize the sustainable engagement. Now, I'll touch on sustainable engagement in a minute. But essentially, Protea Gather, we want to enable the community's coordination to be at scale. And we want to let trust be facilitated on Gather through the blockchain. So you can think of Protea Gather as like your typical centralized platform like meetup.com. But the difference here is that we are more flexible and our system is open source. And we're actually looking to make some waves with Protea Gather where we want to create millions of connections and meaningful ones at the same time. So our mainnet release is actually happening this Thursday, on the 30th of May. And essentially on this mainnet beta, you'll be able to open the door to measuring a community's social capital. And this is something quite new. By measuring a social capital, it kind of allows you as a member or community owner gauge how effectively your society is functioning. And the way that this is possible is through tokenization. Everyone who wants to be a part of the community stakes value into that community. And you don't have to give that value away, but you actually use it to interact with your community events. So when you want to attend a community event, you show commitment and trust by putting some of your stake on the line. And only if you attend, you'll be able to kind of get that stake back. So let's walk through like a use case here. A perfect example is the remote Ethereum meetup community that's happening. And there are so many different remote calls happening within the remote Ethereum space, this being one of them. Tomorrow night, we also have the ETH organizers remote call that's happening. You have your creation markets call, and there's also a few token engineering calls that are happening on a month-to-month basis. So all of that kind of falls within this community. And let's assume that that community is put on Protea, and anyone is able to join or even create a community within this. And if you want to host an event, you can. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So let's kind of take it another step further and introduce you to a guy called Bob, the man, the myth, and the legend. And he lives in the jungle of Africa, and that doesn't really matter. He's been a part of the blockchain community call for a while. Now, he wants to join the remote Ethereum meetup community on Protea Gather. And the reason for this is that he would want to connect with more like-minded crypto fans and also show his support for this community with so much potential. Now, on Protea Gather, Bob is just going to simply search for that remote Ethereum meetup community, and checking the community details, he sees that the event staking usually is around about 5 to 10 DAI. Now, if nobody on here really knows what DAI is, I'm not going to dive into the intricacies behind it, but I just want you to assume that one DAI represents $1 US, and that holds the same value. So what Bob is going to do in order to join this community is going to stake in 10 DAI, and this stake is pretty much represents his buy-in to the community. Now, only a small percentage of that 10 DAI will actually be given to the community itself, and the rest is just going to represent how much he believes his stake in the community is worth. And because these markets are driven by token bonding curves, as Tyler mentioned in his presentation, as more people buy into the community and as the community grows, Bob's stake is actually going to grow too. So just a small note, here's the token bonding curves, and I'm not going to dive into the intricacies. If you guys need further resources on this, please do ask in the questions, and I'll try and get you guys to be directed in the right way. But essentially, we on Protea Gather are using token bonding curves to create automated markets. And this is a key feature. And I'm going to say it again, as more people stake in, your value that you staked in early on will essentially grow. So moving back to Bob, Bob has now joined the Remote Ethereum Meetup community. And what he'll do is he'll search for any upcoming events within the community, and he'll see that, the blockchain community call comes up. So he obviously wants to attend this. So in order to RSVP, he wants to put 5 of his stake DAI, his original 10 that he put in, less the percentage that he contributed to the community. He'll put 5 in of his stake DAI on the line, signaling that he'll pitch up. In simple terms, Bob is putting his money where his mouth is. And on the surface, this pretty much just looks like a simple RSVP incentive mechanism. But if you look deeper, the Remote Ethereum community is actually creating sustainable community engagement, as those who genuinely care about the Remote Ethereum community and the events that they run will actually take part and attend these events. This avoids that erratic attendance and erratic behavior that can actually affect the reputation and the survival of a community. So at the event, which is happening right now, let's assume Bob is here. And at the event, well, towards the end, after the Q&A, someone will, like Nicole, in fact, the community owner of this, she will share a QR code at the end where everybody here, including Bob, will scan that QR code to confirm his attendance. And what that does essentially is prove forever and ever that he was at this event and he showed that he had commitment to join. And because it's on the blockchain, it'll always be there and it'll show who has attended. So he will get his stake back because he actually did put his money where his mouth is. But the people that had originally staked prior to and didn't attend this call will lose their stake. And the people that did attend will obviously get an even distribution of the remaining stake that was left over. So essentially, you can buy in, get your stake back, and actually leave with more. So let's hope Bob actually does do that. And you guys can actually be a part of this and be just like Bob. On Thursday, we are releasing this beta version of Gather on mainnet at the Linum Labs head offices in Cape Town. So if you're in Cape Town and you're at a loose end and you'd like to join and be a part of this, please feel free. And it's going to be really exciting. And this community is obviously going to go live on Protea, but there's so many others in the pipeline that I can't mention right now, but we will mention on Thursday. And potentially in our Protea Telegram too. So if you guys would like to join that, Florian, if you don't mind, can you just share the link? And you guys are more than welcome to join and ask any additional questions regarding Protea Gather and also the Protea X protocol as well. I didn't touch on that too much. I feel like that's another whole presentation in its own. And yeah, I think other than that, I'll leave it to Q&A. And yeah, thank you very much for your time, guys.
Thanks so much, Wayne.
So maybe would it make sense for me to go through and answer some of the questions that have been raised in the chat, or do we just want to open it to a dialogue?
Yeah, so I will either read just one second, my screen here. I'm happy for whoever to ask the question to kind of ask it themselves, but otherwise I normally just read them out. Manj, are you still on the call with us? And would you like to ask Tyler your question? Okay, so
go for it, Nicole.
Yeah, so yeah, Tyler, I think the first part of the question.
Cool. So I'll start with the one that says, how do we get to 0.012% chance of success? Presume this is to get the drug from development to market. So that figure actually takes into consideration all of the compounds that are initially screened in the process of drug development. So you could sort of think of drug development sort of like this progressively narrowing pipeline. You start out by screening, let's say, a very large library of molecules. From that, you let's say test if any of those molecules have activity against a target that you're interested in. You optimize, let's say, a few of those and begin testing them. So, I mean, that number might be a bit misleading, but a better thing to say would be, let's say, 1 out of every 4,000 molecules that are discovered or screened actually makes it to market. If, for example, if you wanted to look at what percentage of drugs that make it to clinical 1 trials ultimately make it to market, that would be much higher. The number would probably be closer to 20 to 30%. But the main thing to focus on here is that drug discovery is very difficult, sort of sticks. And then what scheduled drugs are we talking? I'm not sure if I necessarily understand. I mean, any scheduled drug. So any piece, and it doesn't even need to just be a drug. This could include supplements. It could include things that like drug delivery systems, drug delivery vehicles, pharmaceutical formulations, any sort of specific compound, a molecule. And just to go on that, there was another question down a bit further that sort of touched on that. Someone said, does molecule need to be limited to drug development? It looks like something that could be applied to any sort of R&D project. And that's sort of true. So I mean, you can use the same sort of fundamental architecture that we're using to distribute fractionalized ownership in chemical intellectual property, conceivably for any type of intellectual property. Similarly, you could probably use the same sort of system to bootstrap and secure funding into any sort of research and development project. The primary consideration here for us is that the pharmaceutical industry is one in which there's an innovation crisis, and where there's sort of a desperate need for these new business models. So in terms of, and there hasn't, it's sort of very archaic in that there hasn't been much in the way of open innovation or much in the way of these sort of open source models. Open source pharma, for example, is a relatively new concept that's been around for 4 or 5 years. But it's one of those areas where, because the cost has become so high, and because obviously innovation ultimately trickles down to patients, right? We need to come up with, we need drugs for rare diseases that pharmaceutical companies don't really have financial incentives to develop. We need to be able to fund tropical disease, things like aging research, for example. A lot of these areas are heavily underfunded and are not necessarily in the interest of the pharmaceutical company, because there might not be a blockbuster drug at the end of the pipeline. So conceptually, this just sort of made sense to do in this market. But maybe it's the case that if we have a lot of success in this space, in the future, we could look at applying this more broadly to other industries. There was another question from Roger, who are the target funders who would fund in this way? I'm assuming that this funding model would not fit the mandate of typical funders. So the way we sort of conceptualize this working, this is not necessarily going to be a platform that is initially used by, let's say, Roche or Johnson & Johnson or Novartis or large pharmaceutical companies that already have sort of a fairly defined development pipeline. I believe initially will likely be used as, let's say, a way to find sustainable business models for developing things like therapeutics for rare diseases, for example, areas where the pharmaceutical industry falls short. And particularly from my perspective, I see it as a way to allow universities, for example, to compete in the drug development landscape again. What we sort of hope to do is to lower the barrier of entry to drug development so that all of the various stakeholders that have been priced out of it can now sort of compete. So from a funding perspective, this might be an appropriate project for, oh, sorry, did you want to say something?
No, I think he doesn't realize he's unmuted. Let me just try and mute him.
Oh, sorry. So from a from a funding perspective, this might be the type of model that, let's say, a grant funder like the Gates Foundation or the Wellcome Trust would be able to examine to essentially create some sustainability around something like grant funding. So where you could actually sort of have a business model to fund malaria research, or a business model to fund the research and development of a drug for a rare disease. But yeah, it might not appeal broadly to all sorts of funders and all sorts of pharmaceutical companies. Natural products do fall within our definition of a drug, although this becomes a little bit complex depending on your ability to actually patent an invention or a discovery. So some natural products, for example, you couldn't personally own the intellectual property around those. There's some formulations that are protected by, for example, trade secrets, where you do sort of have maybe the ability to make a claim that you have a formulation or an invention, but it's important to realize that the core sort of piece of intellectual property that these markets are being built around are patents. We hope to get into working on sort of pre-patent early stage discoveries where investment you might be, let's say, bound by an NDA to not disclose information if you invest into these markets, and also try to examine ways that we might be able to let's say, develop something completely open source, so without any patents. But again, this becomes a bit difficult because how we define ownership in those cases is very different. So it might be that if you invest into a market to fund the development of an open source drug where no one actually owns the intellectual property, what you're buying, for example, would be governance rights around how those funds are spent towards its development. It becomes a bit more abstract in that case.
Just a quick one from Gino towards the end. A quick question from Gino is, can funding for Molecule be anonymous?
So no, so if you, it's people have to be KYC'd, investors' identities need to be known. So no, and I mean, maybe in the future, if there was a very compelling reason to enable that functionality, perhaps it would make sense. But at this point, we're kind of moving towards increased transparency. I think it's actually important to know, just to give an example, if a cigarette company was investing into, a drug, let's say, for X or Y, or I mean, there's any number of examples you can come up with, but I think transparency is a problem. It is sort of a very big problem already in the pharmaceutical industry, where money comes from, how it's spent, how experiments are carried out. We want things to be fairly open and transparent. And with regards to who funds Molecule now, initially we had a sort of an initial seed round. And we're currently going through an additional round of fundraising at the moment.
Tyler, another question from Gino. I think you answered his question on whether natural drugs fall into the definition of a drug.
Yep.
So I think that's all your questions. If there are any additional questions for Molecule, feel free to pop them in again. I think that's...
I would also just like to mention briefly, I'm sorry, if anyone wants to chat about this, we're really trying to build a community around this to spread awareness, and what we touched on today is sort of a very surface level, high level overview of what we're building. If people are interested, if they want to engage, I would be happy to chat to anyone personally via email. I'll pop my email address in the chat here, and please reach out, get involved. Would love to have continued conversations with people who are interested in the technology.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. That's brilliant. We, just as a segue, we have our Molecule community call, and Tyler will be on that call as well, presenting on the 13th of June. I have left a few links for our upcoming events in the chat channel, so feel free to go on there and register. We'd be happy to answer any questions you may have that you haven't been able to ask on this platform. But it would be great for just some interaction and to chat about what we're working on. Thanks so much, Tyler.
Cool, thanks guys, really appreciate it.
And then for Wayne, I'll just gather all of your questions. The first question is from Jenny, who asks, how do you reward commitment through Gather? So we just want to answer that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. So the first way in which Protea Gather would reward commitment is that we're obviously trying to incentivize you to get in early and obviously stay loyal to that community. And through that, as the community grows, the stake that you had initially put in will grow too. And then eventually you'll get a return on investment in that sense. Then at the same time, your act of actually going to the events and interacting with the events that are happening, you have a chance of getting part of those your stake back in sorry, I'm speaking on my words, but if you stake into an event and the people that also staked into an event, you have a chance of people not attending. And that leftover amount is evenly distributed to the people that did attend. So by following through with your actions, you actually are rewarded through that level of commitment too. So there's those two things there.
Yeah, Jenny, and if you want to take up another conversation with Wayne, we've left some of the links as well, just in case the question you feel like there's another part to your question. The second one is from Gino, who asks, "What are your metrics to measure sustainable engagement?" And then, is DAI the only token on Protea Gather?
Okay, I know the DAI question Florian would definitely like to answer, but in terms of the sustainable engagement metrics, you kind of assess how many events have happened, how many people have RSVP'd, and then obviously afterwards how many people have actually attended. And you can kind of gauge from there how functional the community is. And that's kind of how you measure your social capital. But Florian, I don't know if you'd like to answer the DAI question.
Sure, very happy to do so. Yeah, so, I mean, we thought about this for a bit. What sort of collateral should we put into our curves? And round about November last year, we decided that DAI, at least for the time being, would be the only collateral. One of the main reasons for that in the case of these communities that are represented by token bonding curves for us is that we want this attention signal to be pure. So if you're an early adopter in a community, you kind of expect your value to grow as the community grows. If, for example, you put in a much more volatile token as collateral in that curve, one scenario could be that token actually reduces in value, which then blurs and skews the signal of the bonding curve. So yeah, we're looking in the short term for pure attention signals that we want to experiment with these curves. But we definitely can see scenarios where in the future, well, especially projects that have their own token, for example, that might want to have a community on Protea. Those could be scenarios where I could see a very good fit for other tokens to be put in place as collateral. And from an architectural perspective, it's super easy. It's just changing a few lines of codes and exchanging the collateral, pointing it to a different ERC.
Thanks, Flo. And then 2 questions on scanning the QR codes. The first one is from Emily, asking, how would you scan a QR code if you are joining from your cell phone?
Okay, so I'm not too sure the context. I'm going to try and answer both as to how I understood that. I just read it now.
Maybe Emily can clarify the question as well.
So I'm assuming she's saying if you're joining from your phone, and it's a remote meetup, so let's say you're joining via Zoom call on your cell phone, how are you going to scan the QR code then? The way around this is probably just getting the organizer can manually confirm you as a backup. Obviously there'll be a recording of it, and we are working around a more concrete way to do that. But then if it was just a physical meetup, obviously Protea Gather is a mobile first DApp. So there is a built-in QR code scanner that will prompt you to use your camera as well. So I'm not too sure if that answers your question, Em.
Yes, it does. I was asking in regards to a remote meetup that you're joining from your phone. So thanks.
Okay.
Perfect. And then Vusi asked, I'll just read his full question. You mentioned that attendees can scan a barcode as proof of attendance at the end of an event. People could potentially get around this by getting others to scan their barcodes for them, or just coming in at the end of an event, scan their barcodes and leave. Is this something that you see happening? And then also, again, Vusi, if you want to ask the question. Hi, Vusi.
Hi, Wayne. Hey, Nicole.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah, so kind of just measuring like contribution at an event. I mean, someone can kind of just get someone else to scan a barcode for them, or come at the end of events and scan their barcode? Like, how do you measure like real contribution, like for an event or in a community or anything like that? Does that make sense?
I'm happy to take it unless you want to take. Awesome.
Go ahead.
Hey, Wizzy. Good to have you on the call.
Cool.
Good question. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the very first thing that I would say is that for this beta release, we're not looking to create a non-spoofable solution. And you're absolutely right. There are ways to spoof this. So you could, for example, not be there at the event. Someone else screenshots that QR code for you and you still confirm your attendance. That's absolutely fine for the time being. It's not the focus of our solution right now to validate a non-spoofable QR solution, but we are thinking about it. So the various ways. I mean, for local meetups, for example, you could wire up a local mesh network that confirms based on also geographical information that the people who are there. I know there are other people who are also specifically working on this vertical of proving attendance or proving interaction. There's a POAP, they're working on that. So for us also, it could be something where we see other protocols maturing in this particular vertical, where we see their solutions plugging into our other pillars that we're focusing on, which we then could leverage.
Cool.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Cool. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks, Flo. And then another question from Gino. He asks, are there dividend payouts built into your economic model for rewards?
So that's quite an interesting one. Once you look more into token bonding curves, you realize that they truly are an autonomous automated market maker, meaning that you have this one price curve which regulates all your buy-ins and buy-outs, and it's 24/7. It's up there for eternity. You can think of dividends in a non-traditional sense, in that at any point in time, once your community grows and you gain value in the amount that you staked, you can take whatever you want out. There isn't a dividend payout mechanism per se, but at any point in time, you're welcome to take out some of your rewards if you wish to do so. Yeah.
Cool, thanks, Flo. And I see that, Jay, your message has been acknowledged by Wayne. Would you like to touch on your comment for anybody else on the call? Jay?
I don't really think that I necessarily need to elaborate on it anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear. So let me just read through it again. If it's a large event, it might be incentivized to steal the QR code from the event host and claim all the reward to yourself. Cool. Might be a good idea to not have one barcode that gets scanned, but rather have attendees scan each other's barcodes. Okay, interesting. So actually the way it works, you have, so architecturally speaking, from a coding perspective, this QR code simply just points to a JSON, which triggers an on-chain transaction, which marks you as having attended. So this one QR code just points to a link that triggers a transaction, which says you have attended. And it's absolutely fine for everybody to sign that same QR code. Not the first person that will sign it will get the reward, but everybody signs it while they're there. And then once the event has ended, the event organizer actually marks it as completed, and then everybody can come and claim their reward back. So there's this period in time where everybody has time to do it. It's not like people get more of a rewards because they confirm their attendance sooner than others. So there's a fair chance for everybody. Yeah.
But I mean, if you steal the QR code, like you steal their phone, then other people can't scan it, right?
Well, so this is an extreme scenario. The QR code is popular. The QR code is generated by the event organizer. So you would kind of have to hold the event organizer hostage and stop the event organizer from showing that QR code. Pardon?
Or you could just take their phone and run away.
Or you could take their phone and run away, exactly. But in that case, you can't end the event yourself, because that is probably protected by Touch ID, and then you have to end the event in order to get through the cycle of claiming rewards. So that actually is a more difficult way to spoof the system. I think what Wizzy was saying earlier, not being at the event and somebody else sending you the QR code is much more vulnerability right now. That I don't see so much, but I'd be keen if you have more specific thoughts around that maybe I'm missing something. If you just drop us a message afterwards, maybe join our Telegram. I'd love to talk more about that if you still see something there that I'm missing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Flo. Thank you, Wayne. Guys, that brings us to the end of our call. Thank you again, both Tyler and Wayne, for taking the time to present and interact with our community. Just before we all hop off the call, I'd like to share some of the physical meetups we have coming up this week and some of our calls. I've already dropped in some links to our calls. As Wayne mentioned, we have the Protea launch happening on Thursday at 6:30 at our offices in Cape Town. You can either go over to Twitter. All of the links are there as well. Tomorrow we have a physical meetup at our office as well with Newton Partners. James, who is a senior associate at Newton Partners, will be touching on what blockchain investors look for when funding a startup. And then I've also linked our community call links to the chat for you to keep up with what we're doing. So we have the Molecule community call as well as the Curation Markets community call. Thanks so much for joining. It's been really fun to see all of you again. And just touching base with what we're up to. All right, I'll see you next month. Thanks again, everyone.
Cheers, everybody. Take care.